But if you purchase your property that's Ugly Duckling, you've got the opportunity to, do forced appreciation to it so you can add value to the property.
We believe every Australian deserves a right to own at the very least 5 investment properties. I'm Adrian Trimboli.
And I'm Frank and Adrian, and welcome to the Invest in You podcast.
Welcome, Frank. We are back. How are you, mate?
Not bad, mate. Ready for another episode. I think this episode's going to be something different from what we've spoken to previously. So excited for this one.
Absolutely. As am I. You're looking very fresh. You've obviously got your Fresh Start Advisory polo, which looks beautiful. I'm wearing the same. Very, very nice. But Frank, as always, I'll let you take the reins. Let's get the mindset minute out there, and then let's start on something which is extremely important, the topic which will be today. But let's get this mindset minute out. What do you got for me?
Never be afraid to try something new, because life gets boring when you stay within the limits of what you already know. I think it kind of relates with today's topic. Now we're talking about, top 10 secrets, I guess, behind identifying a hotspot. Now, if we don't push ourselves to grow, of course, we get stale and we become boring and old. But what this quote relates to is, I guess, not just sticking to what you know, not just sticking to your own investment, knowledge to some degree of investing in your own backyard and just saying, oh, this is what I know, I'll stay here and just buy investment properties here and not, look over the horizon. And because there's always the grass is always green on the other side as well. And so, today we're talking about, how to identify these hotspots, how to find a new potential location that is going to be the next place that's going to produce some really, really good prospects, significant growth, significant cash flow increases over a long period of time, and I guess the desirability of people moving there. So I want to talk about, I guess, our first tip. So you want to introduce what the tip is of number one. That is probably one of the most important pieces of this puzzle, Age.
Yeah, I will. And on top of all that, just on the back of that quote, unfortunately, what has been happening in property let's just talk about Australia. Something that we always refer back to is 0.4% of Australians own more than 3 properties. So the old way is actually not the best way. And that's just going off that particular stat. So you need to literally do something different in order to become a really successful property investor. So great quote. Number one, absolutely. It is the most important, or one of the most important. I shouldn't say the most important, because collectively they are all very, very important. But something which you and the team really base your suburb area selection off is the infrastructure, and in particular the transport infrastructure, which is going on in a particular region. And now I know every time, or most times, when I come to your computer, you've got something up, you've got some article up, or you're looking into what is being done in a particular region, and you've got a process behind it. So I'll let you take the reins and kind of talk about this, if you could.
Yeah, so I think this is probably one of the most important pieces of the puzzle here, infrastructure. And what type of infrastructure? So we're talking about transport. So we're talking about roads, bridges, transport, things like this that's going to, have a massive effect. Now, I'll talk about some projects that have happened in the past and what it's done for the economy. So let's go to Brisbane. Brisbane had a motorway from Brisbane to Ipswich upgrade. Once they've done that upgrade, we've seen some massive growth through that corridor all the way heading down towards Ipswich. They spent billions of dollars. Same goes with, there was a railway crossing, a crossrail project that was getting done in north of Brisbane. Now, this was a $5 billion project on the M1. Things like this have a massive contribute to, all these individual suburbs. Something getting created, something like this nothing like this has ever been done to a region. And so these new infrastructure or transport infrastructure project have an effect, have a massive effect on the property market. Now, you might think it's a road or transport line or whatever, or a bridge or a tunnel. How can it have so much of an effect? Which is a great question, but it comes down to, I guess, depending what infrastructure project being implemented into a region at what sort of time in duration. Now, not every project is created equally. Okay, because let's hypothetically say let's say the M1 in Melbourne, the Western Ring Road. Now they're starting to do, they're starting to increase the lanes once again. They've done this, I think, 2-3 times now, and it's gone from a 2-lane to 3-lane, 4-lane now, maybe potentially. I think it's going to be a 5-lane. Now, that project, when it first started, was probably the best time to have a look, and that had an influence on those surrounding suburbs. At the moment, it's not really having any effect on the property market. Of course, those markets have already been established. They've already been growing. They've already had other driving factors in the past. And now that, now it's something that is contributing to those property markets. But, we have to look at things, what's happening and what's coming in new. So, for instance, there's an inland rail project. Okay, this is going all the way down from starting in Brisbane, going down towards Logan, then coming up through Ipswich, going to Toowoomba, Oakey, and then all the way up down to up towards Gladstone. Now, during this project, there was a lot of small locations, suburbs. Some of these were rural towns because of inland rail. It's on the coastline, it's inland. These places had significant price growth, 40% plus in 1 year alone. And why? Because, jobs getting created and, they're starting to stimulate the economy with, work, but not just that. There's industries, now going to certain pockets because maybe the logistic companies or, maybe agriculture companies, and, they're starting to use this inland rail. It's being used for a purpose. Okay. So things like this have a massive effect on the economy. Now, is there anything you want to jump in?
Can I ask there, just not a novice question, but a question that probably a lot of the viewers are really going to be thinking about as they hear you say that. What does transport infrastructure actually have an effect on a property market and how well that performs? Can I ask that question?
Yeah, good question. So let's have a look at like a road, like the Bruce Highway, or like some of the roads I've already spoken about. Now, let's say it takes 90 minutes to get to the CBD. Okay. Now they spend billions of dollars. The government will spend, or the state government will spend billions of dollars on this transport infrastructure. It can be rail, it can be road, it can be whatever it may be. Once they've taken that 90 minutes and they've changed the roads, they've changed everything, and now it's actually shortened that by 20 to 30 minutes. That does have a desirability. Now, those cheaper out of fringe suburbs will start to grow in value. Why? Because people no longer have to live so close to those places that are really gentrified and they're really starting to become really expensive. So what happens, the ripple effect will start to happen, and this starts to go out to the outer fringe suburbs. Now, not just that, which there's 10 secrets that we're talking about here. So this is just one, but each secret actually contributes with each other. So they all link up with each other. Okay, and so which we'll talk about what it does, but basically what will happen is it'll create jobs for people, the construction workers, creating jobs, roads and the rail lines, etc. But notice that when there's rail as well getting implemented into a region, now transportation becomes you don't have to use your car. You can jump on a train and commute to work, and you can live out of the outer fringe suburbs, and maybe it's more desirable. Maybe you enjoy it there. Maybe it's more fresh air. I guess it's not as busy, the hustle and bustle. So things like this start to happen. People think, oh, but I'll never want to live there. But that's individuals. But there's so many people that live in so many places where we don't like to live, and there's peace, and vice versa. So it has an effect. Okay, it happens slowly. This doesn't happen overnight. But when you start to see these announcements being released by the state government, the federal, okay, and even council level, these things do have an effect. Okay, when you start to see these small little towns, or the towns that are starting to, have some sign of transportation infrastructure getting implemented, that will have a massive effect on these markets. Does that make sense?
Yep, beautiful, perfect answer. Exactly, I think what might have been going through a few of the viewers or the listeners' ears. And well, there you have it. There you go. Thank me later. Beautiful. All right. Have you got anything more to go through in regards to particular transport infrastructure?
So what I want to talk about is it's important to make sure when you're looking at these projects, going onto the state government website or federal government website, and you got to see when you look at these projects where they are, because there's all different types of levels of what they. How can I talk? There's I guess a tender stage where they're tendering for the project. So what happens is there'll be companies tendering for the job. From that point on, they're going to see if they can, start planning for the job. So there's a planning phase as well. So then with the planning phase, you will see this on the website. So you understand the project is in planning. And then, of course, there's going to be a construction phase of where it's starting to get built and it's starting to, commence the work. And then there's going to be a completion phase. But what you've got to make sure is that they've actually starting to, once the planning stage is being implemented, you got to make sure that it's getting implemented, because what's going to happen is different stages of when they're doing these plans or these significant, infrastructure projects. We want to make sure that these projects are getting started. For example, everyone knows about Geelong and Ballarat, and Taralga and Bendigo. There was supposed to be a high-speed rail from these destinations heading into Melbourne. Shorting up time. You look at from going from Geelong to Melbourne in a car, peak hour, going to work was 1 hour plus. Now they wanted to put in a high-speed rail, 30 minutes maximum time from getting from Geelong to Melbourne. Same goes from Taralga to Melbourne. It was 72 minutes. I think it's nearly a 2 hour or 3 hour car ride, from Taralga to Melbourne. So they're wanting to put these high-speed rail lines in, but this has been going on for some quite time of planning and trying to get this over the line, which it hasn't happened. So you've got to make sure that these projects are going to get implemented. Now, Geelong, of course, and Ballarat and Taralga have done very well with price growth, but there's had other infrastructure projects being implemented as well. But it's just making sure on these projects, this doesn't just go for transport infrastructure. This even goes for other infrastructure projects we'll talk about in another series, of course, hospitals and universities and etc. So making sure where they're at with their stage of the build. Does that make sense, Paige?
Yeah, no, it does. And I know there's been a fair few projects which you've kept your eye on. One here in Melbourne, which was released, it was going to come out, never actually ended up happening. The state actually lost money on that, a lot of money behind it, and nothing ended up happening. So, yeah, it's a very, very good point to obviously work out and understand. There is obviously a tendering stage, there is obviously planning stage, but it needs to actually go through in order for you to go off this exact methodology. Once it goes through, that's when the growth will come. So very important. All right, awesome. Number 2. Now remember, guys, sorry, just to go before you introduce it. This is in no particular order. This is not your 1, 2, 3. This is how it needs to be looked at. We're just saying the top 10. This is what you need to do. Okay. Maybe at the end we might go down a way of saying what's your most important, what's your not. But I think collectively they are all the most important. So number 2, Frank, let's go for it.
So we've got our Ugly Duckling Syndrome. So people like to put down some suburbs, I should say, put down these suburbs that are really rough and gringy, and you wouldn't live there, because you're like, oh, it's got a bad association, negative association. Maybe because of the demographic of people, or maybe because there's not much out there, and there's not much infrastructure. There's not much, shops and all the other, retail stores and all the things that you go to maybe to an inner suburban town. Now, or maybe it's just got that bad vibe, Now these are some places where you start to see gentrifying happen. Okay, for instance, if we look at Richmond, Frankston, Maverickville in New South Wales, we look at Blacktown in New South Wales. These places, once upon a time, were a place where you wouldn't want to invest or even buy a house to live in because of the association or the demographic of people living there. Now, it was really gringy, it was really rough. But when these signs of markets are the signs where you start to capture and you go, don't follow the crowd, because the crowd will always lead towards somewhere where I guess the rush is, and that's where I guess you're too late to where you want to go to an investment. It's like you hear on the news, this place is on fire at the moment, blah 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 blah. There's been significant growth. There's been an influx of sale prices, and prices have grown dramatically in the last, say, 1 year or 2 years. What happens is people will start going there. The herd's already been, and there's a rush now. And what happens is you start, overpaying for properties, and you start to see massive price growth. But really, you should have been there a year or two ago. Now, places like the Ugly Duckling Syndrome is a great place, a great thing to look out for, because these places, once upon a time, were grungy, had a bad vibe, but they've turned into something real beautiful. Same with Footscray. Footscray in Victoria was a place where people didn't want to invest, but it changed the demographic of people, or not so much, but there was gentrification. There was things starting to happen. Movement of people. There were new shops. There was a cafe vibe, and they started to change the landscape of the whole, I guess, LGA there. So this starts to happen, and something to look out for, because people think, oh, these places will never go up in value, which they have. Every place, when there's gentrification, and you've got your number one tip that we've just given on transport infrastructure starts to happen. Of course, the Ugly Duckling Syndrome is going to have a significant effect on this, because this is where it's at the startup of a change of the location. Now, I want to talk about.
I might just jump in there, Frank, because you made some really good points. I just want to highlight those two things that you did say. So, exactly what you said. Go against the herd, right? Back to the fact that I just pulled out, which we always refer to at the start. 0.4% of Australians have 3 investment properties or more. Obviously, you can't go with the herd and expect to replace your income or buy 10 properties in 10 years, which is very, very possible if you're just going to do what the rest of Australia does. So obviously, at that point there, you need to go do something else. Perfect with exactly what you said, the Ugly Duckling Syndrome. I think another really good point that you said. So when the market, or when on the news, there's an area that's popping up saying killer sales, everything's going right. Of course, yes, everyone's finding out about that particular market now. But going back to kind of your 5-year window of how long a property market will grow in value by more than 10%. If it's likely to be, so I don't know if you want to touch on that, but if it's likely been on the news and all these other kind of big time articles, and the rest of the population have found out, and more than likely that property market has been growing by more than 1 or 2 years already, meaning it's only probably got maybe 3 at most, 3 years left of strong double-digit growth before it comes out. Whereas obviously what we try and do, we try and identify that market in the first year, if not the first 6 months, right? And when we've got growth for a client, we're getting 4 years at a minimum. Really strong growth. That was it. And the other thing I just wanted to touch on, sorry for taking the limelight, but I just want to touch just exactly on what you said. You mentioned a couple of areas, your Footscrays, your Richmonds, the ones in Victoria, right? Now, they were ugly ducklings, your Port Melbournes, right? They were ugly ducklings. But if you actually have a look at those areas, right, all the fundamentals kind of stack up. Let's talk about Port Melbourne. Let's talk about Richmond, so close to the CBD. So close to the border, a lot of infrastructure spend going on. Your Port Melbourne as well, it's right there by the water. It's a stone throw away from the CBD. All the other fundamentals stacked up. However, what didn't stack up is it was a rough area, had a lot of public housing potential. But still, if you invest in there 20 years ago, 30 years ago, what it looks like today, awesome. So exactly. Just those 2 little things, but thank you very much. Go on. Sorry.
No, great point you made there. And it's good that you let people get those key takeaway points, because that's something to to understand and look at. When you're an investor, you can't just look at one side. You got to look at it. It's like a Rubik's cube. You got to look at it all sorts of sides and have a look at all the pieces and puzzles and all the colors. Okay, so what I want to touch on with this is from a macro level here. So we're looking at this from a bird's eye view of the town, of what's going on. Now let's go for micro level, and let's start looking into the streets. So this is something that rarely gets talked about. So I like to talk about the Ugly Duckling Syndrome as well when we get to a street. When we get to a street and we're purchasing a property, I want to look at the actual property itself. Now, as an investor, Some investors want to purchase the nicest property in the street. They want to buy the nicest property in the street, the house that's had maybe a new paint job. It's got maybe it's a new, more of a newish property. Maybe it's had a renovation recently. It's the most expensive property in the street, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you purchase the ugliest property in the street, and your property is devalued a significant amount compared to the other properties that are beautiful, well maintained, they've been, the maintenance has been upkept on them over a long period of time, and your property is maybe 100 or 200 or maybe even a little $300,000 lesser value because it needs a bit of TLC. This is something that's your secret weapon. Now, I like to not purchase the nicest property in the street for my clients. Of course, it comes down to the individual as well, okay, and depending on their goals and what they're trying to achieve. But if you purchase your property that's ugly duckling, you've got the opportunity to, do forced appreciation to it so you can add value to the property. So let's say the property is $200,000 less of what your house is next door that's had a significant renovation done to it. Now, let's just say you go in there and you spend $50,000. As an investor, you start forced appreciating. So you're manufacturing your equity. You're making it grow right away from the day one. You're not waiting for natural appreciation where you're just letting the property sit and just grow in value by the nature of inflation, but you're actually forcing it to grow. So it's called forced appreciation. Now, you're doing that. You've got the upper hand. You can put a new bathroom in. Maybe do the kitchen up. Maybe do some floorings, paint the walls. Maybe do the fence at the front, whatever it may be. And then you can, you're manufactured your equity position. And so then it allows you to release that equity to go again. So that's why I mean by being the ugliest property in the street, because you've got the upper hand now. You know what your property is worth. If you've got a property that's 2 doors down next door, or 2 doors, 3 doors down, that's worth 400 and you bought yours at 300 or 250, okay? Then that means you can potentially do the same thing. If it's on the same block and it's the same similar house where maybe they're both weatherboards or maybe they're both brick homes, both double car garage or both four bedders, whatever it may be, you then know you've done your DD, your due diligence, and you can use that ugly duckling syndrome to your advantage.
I love it. You probably noticed me writing down little things here because I want to just again touch on 3 beautiful points. That's 3 golden nuggets that I just gathered from there, which I'm just going to summarize for the listeners. So obviously this comes down to the type of investor that you are. Okay, some of our clients very willing to put in 20, 30 grand for, let's say, a quick renovation straight away. Some of our clients don't want it. Awesome. No problem at all. You've obviously got to take into consideration that if you do a significant renovation or just a smaller type renovation, you potentially may not be able to have tenants in there at that particular time. So you need to have that need to have that buffer. Now, when you said the ugliest property in the street, I don't think we go for maybe the ugliest. I think we go for, I just wanted to highlight there, we're still going for properties that are livable, of course. We're not going to purchase something that is completely decrepit, that's not, completely unlivable. If that happens to be the ugliest property in the street, awesome. As long as we still know that straight away we are going to be able to find a tenant, or if our client is obviously willing to do a renovation straight away, within 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to be able to find a tenant. So I think that was good to illustrate. And then obviously the last thing, which you did mention, doing this method, it gives you more control. It gives you a hell of a lot more control. Now, there could be properties, we purchase multiple properties, whereby it could be the ugliest property in the street, but the street's actually really, really nice. So that ugly property, what that actually means is it doesn't actually need any work now, but in 5 years or 10 years' time, it might. And what that means that in 5 or 10 years' time, when the market is not in that double-digit growth period, right, you have the ability to spend, say, 20, 30 grand on a renovation. All of a sudden, you've got another extra 100K in equity, plus you're able to raise the rent as well. So it just gives you back more control. Exactly what you said, not relying on the market to do what it has to do. Market's going to do what it has to do if you go through these 10 fundamentals and do that. But then if you have extra control on top of that, you put yourself in a really good position to get into the next property. So beautiful. I love that.
Yeah, it is. It's good that you broke it down like that, because give people, I guess, the real, understanding of what we mean by this, because like you said, you're not waiting on the market to grow. You're manufacturing it. You're going in there and you're doing it right away. if you've done your due diligence correctly and you know what the market's going, where it's going. Now, let's just say your property grows. We've got one client, it's already grown 20%, 23% in 6 months. Now, it could do it for renovation. If you did do a renovation on the kitchen and bathroom, you probably get an extra 28% of growth or more in that property right away, just by doing those renovations. So imagine then you're actually doubling your ROI, which is your return on investment, really. So if you're getting a 23% growth, let's make it round. You're making 20% growth from this natural appreciation where the property is just growing. And then you do something because you use the ugly duckling syndrome as your strategy, and you've gone in there and you've put in, like Adrian said, $10,000 to $30,000 adding value to the property. You've done your numbers, you made sure you had a buffer, that the property's going to be vacant for some time, but you've done this renovation. Then what happens is it's improved the quality of the property, maybe another 10 or 20% in value. So then what happens is then you can release that equity, and you can use that equity to go in and use it as buy another property. Now, make sure you do your numbers correctly. Of course, you want to make sure you've had a look at what the other properties that are in your street or in the next street, what they look like, what they're valued at, what's the level of, detail. If they're, by using, you can use realestate.com or domain, looking at what they've done inside and kind of doing something similar, so you can, capture that growth as well. So it's a great tool to use. Both of these tools that we've spoken about, transport infrastructure, ugly duckling syndrome. So ugly duckling syndrome from, a bird's eye view of the actual suburb itself, and then as well from a street level as well. So these two fundamentals are really important to use. I guess if you do use it, like Adrian said, you want to be in that small percent of Australian investors that have 3 or more investment properties, which is 0.4%. You want to be in that percent, and you don't want to be following the herd, which is the most important thing. If you follow the crowd, you will get the same results as majority of Australian investors. So you got to do something very different and have a strategic understanding of why you're doing it, and the benefits you'll reap the rewards of those benefits moving forward.
Awesome. Love it. Now, we're going to be bringing these out 2 at a time. Okay. 10 is a lot. So we'll give you time to digest every 2. Make sure you jot it down, because, essentially the goal for us at the end of these 10 is you essentially are going to be in a position whereby you can then go out, look at the 10, the decision you're going to then make when you go and determine what region you're going to invest in, what property you're going to invest in. It's going to be so much. You're going to be sitting from a point of view of that 0.4%. So sitting at the point of view, Frank and I, we both are in that 0.4%. We've helped people get into that 0.4%. Okay, so we're going to teach you the 10 aspects, the 10 fundamentals that you need to look at. Okay, 2 by 2. We'll release them every week. But beautiful, Frank, that was a very, very good session. And yeah, thank you guys so much. We'll see you on the next one.
If you like today's podcast, then you're absolutely going to love the Invest in You Facebook group, where we share a bunch of valuable tips and tricks on property investing for our exclusive community. Come join us and let's level up.